All right, hi everyone. We are a small and intimate crowd today, it seems. Welcome to the panel on historical and international perspectives on community media. My name is Christopher Alley. I guess I'm the de facto chair. I am a assistant professor at the University of Virginia, although from Winnipeg originally. So we've got 4 presenters today. Kathy's going to come in and out. Everyone's going to have 15 minutes, and hopefully we'll be able to get into a really great conversation afterwards. So I'll invite our first speaker, Dorothy Henno, to come up and start us off.
Thank you. Okay, well, I was asked to talk about the history a bit, and I worked in Challenge for Change from 1968. We did the film about the first project in the world called VTR Saint-Jacques is on tonight at 8 o'clock. And we started working with video as a tool in community organizing and accessible. And simultaneously, in Thunder Bay, which at that time was still Prince Arthur and Fort William, there was a group called Town Talk, and Lois Wilson, who worked for the United Church, was part of the thing. She ended up being the United Church moderator at one point. She was a fantastic woman, and they organized. They sort of got together a whole bunch of different people in Thunder Bay, and what became Thunder Bay, and they organized a thing called Town Talk. And it was, what they did was they organized a series of television shows that were on the local broadcast television at midnight on Sunday night, which had a phone-in element built into it, in which they dealt with various problems of the community. And it was a fantastic success. They had huge numbers of people phoning in, and it was really a very exciting experience. And I actually, as a rep of Challenge for Change of the National Film Board, which I guess I should repeat, Challenge for Change was a program of the National Film Board in conjunction with government departments to improve communications and provoke social change. And I went there, and I went to one of the sessions, and it was really fun and exciting. And so Challenge for Change started to think, well, maybe this is a good spot to look at community television, because we knew that was just starting. So the film board, Challenge for Change, sent in a filmmaker to teach young people in Prince Arthur and Fort William to make films, which I thought was one of the stupidest things in the world, but they didn't listen to me. Make films when they're going to be doing video and TV. They did learn video as well. And they ended up getting a slot on the community television, which was a local community television. And they found that they were working so hard producing to fill, I'm not sure how much time they had to fill, one full evening a week or something, but it was a huge amount of work for a small amount of young people. They didn't have time to train people. They didn't have time to do anything. And nobody in the whole mix knew anything about community organizing. They knew nothing about how communities function. So they did a lot of galloping around on high horses, and eventually got so provocative that there was pressure from Thunder Bay put on Challenge for Change to say, hold these guys in. So Challenge for Change said, hold these guys in. And the problem was all the money was coming from Challenge for Change. So they couldn't do anything, but nobody had ever organized. They were like, Town Talk was a friend, but there was no structural relationship between the community television crew and Town Talk. And Town Talk didn't really want to become a charter board, but I think some of the people on it could have, Challenge for Change used to never go into a community unless they had long-term relationship with an institution, usually a university. In Newfoundland, it was Memorial University. When we did a project in Drumheller, Alberta, it was the University of Calgary, who, between the School of Social Work and the Extension Department, hired a community development worker to work for a minimum of 2 years in the community. And then we came in with the video cameras and trained him, and he trained the local people. And the film about that, called VTR Rosedale, is also going to be tonight, which is a real hoot. But it was very effective. But in Thunder Bay, we didn't do that. There was no partner institution. And the Film Board's a big institution. It can do so much. But if it's not based locally, then it's gone. And it was a key moment because the CRTC was looking at the structures of community cable. It was just coming up. And because the Film Board had not understood how a charter board could work or how it could be set up, the system in Canada was set up with the cable company holding the reins, making the decisions, and volunteers could beg for whatever they could beg for. And in the United States, and Sue Buskey, you'll hear her tomorrow, she's on a thing, they insisted that the community board, which I think they got their license from the municipality or something. They got their licenses from the municipality, and the community board was legally responsible for whatever went on the community channel. Whereas in the Canadian system, the cable company is legally responsible, so they can censor anything by saying that this is going to jeopardize our license, or we're going to get sued or something like that, which is the muscle they have for the censorship that they make. So my theory is that I don't know what we do now. Maybe the boat has gone, but maybe we can also, maybe there's a new thing happening, and it's possible to say we will get community boards very widely. You get the churches and the unions and you get everybody, all the ginger groups and all the ordinary people's groups together and make a community board that is interested in dialoguing with the community. And one of the rules that you have to have is it's not PR for your organization. It's dialogue with the community. I don't know if it's too late, but that's something that I think needs to be thought about. Whether a community board can have some muscle. And since this is an international, a panel about international things, I have to tell you about, I just mentioned you, Sue. We're talking about the structure of a community board.
Yeah.
And how it's different in the States and much better for free.
I'll talk about that tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. And the only other thing is, in 1975, I went to Australia, invited because the Australians wanted to find out about Challenge for Change and about what we were doing. And they had, somebody from the Australian Film Board had come to Canada and come to Montreal and seen Videograph, which was a street front video access center, and decided they set up 12 of them, 5 in Sydney alone, 3 in Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane. It was quite amazing, and they were terrific because they knew that they weren't just media freaks. They were media freaks who were really interested in social change. Their staff were really interesting. And I just want to tell one story of one of the things that they did. And that was there was a group in a neighborhood in Sydney who were having a lot of trouble with traffic. A lot of trucks were going by, and it was very dangerous because it was a residential neighborhood. So they made a videotape about it, and they wanted to talk to the Minister of Transport. And they phoned and tried to get an appointment and couldn't, but they knew that the minister was passing through the airport at a certain time. So they went with their monitor and they caught him at the airport, and they said, we want you to see this. It's very important about the dangerousness of our neighborhood. And they showed it to him, and they videotaped his answer right there and took it back to the neighborhood. And it eventually took the time that it took, but it eventually led to changes in the traffic rules in that particular neighborhood. So I thought it was an interesting example of activism. And a lot of people have missed what I said about the fact that as long as the cable company has control, can censor you, you're in deep doo-doo. And
Dorothy, do you want me to play that video for you during your piece?
which video?
The Challenge for Change video?
You could do it just as soon as I'm finished.
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to say that I was just talking to a couple of people from Montreal who just are pushing against Videotron and are trying to get proper access, and they were pushed for a community board, and Videotron said that they would refuse anybody who belonged to their association, and they named their friends to the board. And I said, don't give up. I said, that is a fight that you really have to fight to win. Eventually, if the legal ownership of the content went from the cable company to the community television group, it would be you wouldn't be as censored by the cable company as you are now. And yeah, it might be fun to just play that 2-minute thing, Kathy?
It's coming.
Okay.
Just copying it over.
Okay. So I can talk on forever, but I'm going to hand it over now.
All right, well, you still have 3 minutes and 25 seconds, so we've got perfect time
here.
for the...
So you explained about how the Challenge for Change became early community TV policy?
Well, I did, yeah.
Yeah.
I talked about Town Talk. I talked about Town Talk and the fact that basically the film board missed the boat. They didn't understand the importance of the community board.
The project that Dorothy was working on was called Challenge for Change, which some of you may know of, but maybe you've never seen little clips of, where the government had sent an NFB film crew out to Fogo Island. Some bright spark thought, before we just move all these people, welfare-ridden people off their island to somewhere else, maybe we better send a film crew and find out what they think.
No, that wasn't what they wanted.
Oh, okay.
They wanted to tell them that they should move off.
Okay. So they sent this film crew, and interestingly, they found, this was before Video Portapack, so what they had was 16 mil film and 67, 68. What they found is that the people refused to speak on the camera, is the version I've heard, until they insisted that they had the right to look at it together as a community, edit it, and sent it back to Ottawa, because they knew that their fate rested on it. And what came out of that was this understanding of a process, well, more than that came out of it. In the course of hearing each other and seeing these videos and describing the challenge that they had in their island, they realized they had the solution to their own problems, that they didn't have adequate roads, they had too many schools, they needed a fishing co-op, and just in the process of seeing themselves in these 60-mil films, they suddenly figured out how to make their island work, and that was their answer to government.
And they saw that they were a lot better than they thought they were. They saw they were more articulate than they thought they were. Because one of the keys to video is that people have such low images of themselves that when they say, hey, I'm not so bad after all.
So what I did was, a couple years ago, I got the National Film Board to give me some clips from that stream of filmmaking, Challenge for Change. This is a little 2-minute capsule from a bit of the Fogo Island film, but also a bit from VTR Saint-Jacques, the sort of seminal one that Dorothy shot in Montreal. And we're going to show the whole 26 minutes of that tonight if you want, but there's just a little clip in this 2 minutes. So just to give you a flavor of what the program was like that spawned Canada's community TV policy. Do I just hit it, Gretchen? Here it is. Can we make it louder? Oh. Oh.
I don't think our government will give these to our
It's playing in little on
Hit the other one. Move your mouse over just a little bit.
Yeah.
Move your cursor over.
Sorry.
There you go.
Oh, it's just playing on the little screen down there in the corner? That's hilarious. It's hard to work a mouse from on top.
I'll get out of the way.
I'm trying to do it, sorry. It's hard to use a trackpad when you're, it's like trying to read upside down.
You're dyslexic, that's okay.
There we go.
And it might need to be louder too.
It's good.
That's good.
How many people have seen Challenge for Change films? Société Nouvelle en français.
Well, I don't think our government will get into our business where they are. Wanting too much money and no big concerns.
That's from your family, Dorothy?
No community is going to get off their ass and do anything unless fellows like you go in there with your equipment and bring them together and make a cohesive unit out of that community.
So a personal friend of mine is Frank Spiller, although I'm not sure if he's still with us. There was the English program director when you were there. His version of what happened is that he and Pierre Junot then went from the film board to the CRTC, and cable happened to be coming in at the time. The government was scared that they were going to flood Canadian homes with U.S. content, and so they said, it's too expensive to send these film crews everywhere to negotiate this positive process. We'll just require that they have an open access channel and put it into community hands. But as you say, they may maybe missed the boat and not really putting it in community hands. I've actually looked at the CRTC archives, and many of the early interventions in 1970, the year 1970, are groups in Toronto filing interventions saying that they were afraid that if it was not, community TV was not administered by not-for-profit organizations like in the United States, and Sue Busky and George Stoney and other people were involved in that same project but took it back to the U.S. and implemented it differently. They were afraid that they would have conflicts of interest with the cable staff. So that's the history that I know. Thanks for coming and sharing a bit.
Well, I just told them that the film board did not understand the importance of a community board and community control, and they allowed the CRTC to, and that's the problem with putting everything in the everything in the hands of filmmakers. It has to be an alliance between filmmakers and community activists, because filmmakers don't know everything, and one of the things they don't know is how communities organize very often.
All right, thank you very much, Dorothy. I think we will pass it on to Kathy Edwards, who's going to give us a take on international perspectives on community television.
So in 1998, if you were listening to me in the volunteer session before this, I was having this fantastic, amazing, life-changing experience being a volunteer coordinator at Shaw in Calgary. And that year, the CRTC made it optional for cable companies to actually have a community channel. And I was asked to write a letter to those 400 volunteers that I had watched slave on behalf of, their communities making programs, and tell them not to come back in September because they weren't required anymore. They were going to go to a commercial local news format. That's what happened outside Quebec. And so that year, well, for a couple of years I sulked and I didn't really understand that there was, policies at the CRTC that were supposed to protect this. It took me a while to figure it out. And I got a small grant in 2001 to make a documentary series about community TV in other countries because I wanted to know what was going on. I mean, it's messed up in my country. I kind of knew what was going on south of the border, and I wanted to see what was going on in other places. So on and off, on little teeny bits of money, I went touring around, and I wrote a report for the CRTC in 2009. Before the last time community TV policy was reviewed. With my findings. They commissioned the report and then they suppressed it before the hearing took place because cable companies didn't like what it said. But it was called Community TV Policy and Practice Worldwide, and it was translated by the CRTC, so it's available in French as well on CACTUS's website, on the FEDE-TVC's website, and on the conference website. And I'll just give you a couple highlights of what was in it for those of you who may not be aware of community TV beyond our borders. What I found in the course of my travels was that there's 28 countries around the world that have a recognizable community TV sector. So, they, in their own equivalent of the CRTC or FCC, they recognize public, private, and community. And it seems that they were set up in 3 waves. And I should make a sidebar that this is a 5-year-old report now that's been passively updated. So people call me about it from time to time and say, it's changed in this place, and I'll update it. But I haven't been actively researching since then. But as far as I know from my networks, it's the situation has held fairly stable. The first wave was here in Canada and the U.S. and grew out of the NFB's Challenge for Change program. And other countries that also implemented cable systems at that time tended to follow suit. So in Western Europe, in Colombia and Brazil, where cable networks were being rolled out, where there were suddenly lots more channels available, people were sending people to North America to see what was going on here, and they would take it home and mimic it, where one channel in the cable system would be opened up for public access. There was initially a cluster of channels in the early 70s which suddenly had cable access because of the rollout of cable. If you recall, at that time, studio cameras were quite unwieldy, expensive. It wasn't really viewed as that practical for small, poor community groups to do. Relatively expensive cable at that time was regarded as a license to make money, and that they had the deep enough pockets to do it. It was a very ambitious mandate. When we look back at the CRTC policy, I don't think we should, in the early days, it was an amazing thing. The second wave, when digital and satellite TVs started to come online in the 80s and 90s, it sort of drove a second round of legislation around the world where people were going, okay, well, we're going to have a whole bunch more channels up on satellite. With digital compression, we're going to be able to have a lot more over-the-air channels than ever before. So a whole lot of new countries started to think, well, should some of this be set aside for citizen use? And we tended to see a bunch of over-the-air community TV legislation started in the 80s and 90s, and by then we already had small camcorders, so it was much more feasible for not-for-profit companies to do it themselves. And that was tended to be, again, in Western countries. And then the third wave, which is maybe the last 15 years, we've seen a lot more developing countries adopt community TV policy. Initially, as many of you may know, radio was viewed as a cheap, portable thing that was easy to teach in developing contexts. It didn't depend on having electricity, so you could run, radio stations where the population could just run battery-operated radios. But as more and more of the developing world has been electrified, community TV, and then community TV has tended to come in its wake. There's sort of been 3 waves, but we're still only at 28 countries where it's really identifiable, and what we've got 170 or something countries. So there's a ways to go. That's a couple of volunteers at a community TV channel in Fiji. And you can hear them speak about what they're learning tonight if you come out to the Historical and International Retrospective. In all of the places where I went, there were common needs that tended to motivate communities to want to produce their own television. some of these we'll recognize, some we may recognize a little less. To express alternative political, religious, or personal points of view, so freedom of expression, that was always big in North America. Secondly, to provide local information and education tailored to the community. And in conversations with U.S. public access programmers over the years, I've tended to find in Canada, there's almost been more of an emphasis on number two, that we should have local information to balance influx of U.S. programming, with freedom of speech a close second, whereas I think it's a bit flipped in the U.S. There's bigger population centers, more media infrastructure. The emphasis has tended to be, as I've understood it, more on the free speech part. You know, there's lots of media there, but it's the free speech for the alternative voices that's important. Many developing contexts especially, it's to program in a local or minority language where there's no commercial content being produced. Across the board, you see it being used to celebrate local art and culture, to discuss and debate local issues. Yeah, and in developing and developed countries alike, you see a desire to demystify technology, and you want to develop media literacy skills in people. So there's subtle variations among regions, but you see these come up again everywhere to some degree. In a few places like Brazil, Mexico, and Australia, community access TV has also been used as a way to document state, corporate, or paramilitary violence or wrongdoing in order to protect local residents. So if any of you have heard of the Chiapas Media Project, I thought I was going to be able to get the head of that project to join us by Skype this afternoon, but she wasn't able to. It would have been interesting to hear what she had to say. But basically, it was an American NGO that set up in the state of Chiapas, taught local landless peasants basically to use video and also to leverage social media very effectively, so that whenever the army came in and was displacing them, they could document it on tape, they could tweet about it, and it to a large degree has protected them. So when you think of General Marcos, that's what we're talking about. What's his name? Subcomandante Marcos, that's it. In Aboriginal Australia, sometimes they've used it to document negotiations and public processes involving government officials, because they found, for example, when they were negotiating rights around Ayers Rock, now called Uluru in Australia, they kept finding they were lied to. They'd think they'd sat down with government officials who said one thing, that they had a deal, and then they would find out they didn't have a deal. So they started bringing video cameras. And there's a really interesting sequence in VTR Saint-Jacques tonight. If you come to see Dorothy's film that she made, exact same thing, where public health officials are being put on tape and they really don't like it. They don't want the idea that what they say, they may be held to what they commit to on tape. So you see this, there's a few places in the world where you see this very specific use of it, particularly among indigenous minorities. A couple of common themes that I found interesting among all the countries. I particularly found this, again, you may think I'm generalizing, but it's what I found when I was visiting U.S. channels. You see it everywhere, but I found it between the North and the South a big difference. Where you find people talking about laissez-faire out-and-out public access, like soapbox public access, I found, looking through hours and hours of tape, that you tend to get programming that's more imitative of commercial models. Like you're only teaching people technical skills, but you're kind of hands-off on content, so that people come in and, they're making local shows, they're doing their garage bands and they're doing their local cooking shows, but they're coming in and doing what they've seen on TV, and they're sort of remaking it for themselves, but it's not necessarily providing a real alternative and approach. Whereas, in my experience, channels founded overseas by NGOs with a specific development purpose, or I saw it more in the northern U.S. states. If there's this, what's the one that just shut? Media Bridges there, that has a strong media literacy mandate, and media literacy is taught with the technical training, you tend to get much higher impact. Like programs are more closely tied to local impact projects. And we have a whole session about this tomorrow called Maximizing Community Impact and Engagement. It's about, instead of just having community media where we make it, we broadcast it and forget about it, it's actually a project that's with the community from start to finish, involving community screening, so there's actually a feedback loop at the other end. It's not just passive distribution. So that was something that I learned in looking at all the results. everybody always wants to know about funding. Some of the ones, we have a funding panel here tomorrow. There's about 12 or 14 different community media organizations. They're going to share a different funding model. Patricia here is going to be moderating that. It's going to be a quick bang, 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 so you get ideas for how to dig yourself out of the holes that you're in. But what I found around the world, there was some common models, and they all had, some pros and some cons. So federal funding models, as we have seen here in Canada, I think with the community TV policy, is very sensitive to politics over time, and so you can lose it all overnight if you're depending on one central source of money. Municipal funding, on the other hand, while it's local and you'd think it's more sustainable, and so, for example, some of our members get municipal funding, like Gary here in the audience from Hay River, it can be subject to editorial tampering. So, for example, your local council is giving you money and then you can't critique them. Was it Gary, you told me that you have a really clear charter so that was it somebody else said that they had a really clear charter so that they're getting the municipal funding, but they can't be interfered with. I think that was at our AGM. We were chatting about that yesterday. So you do see that in other jurisdictions too. Membership fees is a way to fund community TV where, in challenging financial environments. So, for example, it's how it works in Brazil and to a large extent in Denmark. Different groups that join are like labor unions, religious groups. They pay a fee, and that's what supports the channel, but then they tend to get the lion's share of the hours of programming, and nobody's doing outreach to the marginalized voices. It's the well-funded groups that are finding a place there. Advertising, of course, can be very challenging for community groups. It splits the management focus, so you're always trying to make those ads, make the commercial production to bring the money in. And I'm sure it's going to be an interesting topic for debate on Tuesday. There's a big spread in Canada on ideas about the appropriateness of advertising on community media, but some people feel it compromises the public service mandate. So you see it around the world, and you have these same conversations. NGO money can be very focused and development-oriented, but it can be fragile and not sustainable. So it tends to be project funding that once your project's gone and you pull out, the project falls apart. And then we have this industry taxation model for community TV and radio now with the Community Radio Fund in Canada, where the commercial industry is asked to kick in for commercial community media. It can provide long-term stability and growth. I think it's fair to say in the U.S. and Canada, recently it's been threatened by media ownership concentration, right? It gets harder to ensure those sources of funding the bigger the contributors become. I'd say that the biggest two challenges looking around the world facing community media, community television at least, with the funding, if it's not stable, the ability of channels to mobilize local dialogue is limited. So it's one thing to have a platform to distribute, but if you can't pay anybody to go out and train, mobilize the marginalized voices, how representative is it really? Everybody seems to face that challenge. And secondly, distribution in the last 10 years. We had a relatively stable situation in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then suddenly satellite came in, digital, we all went digital. So there's all these proliferation of platforms now that imply a constant need for lobbying on behalf of small community groups just to maintain their place. And, it's tied into the CRTC's current investigation into discoverability. It's not just how do we find Canadian content, but how are we finding community content too in that new universe. I think that's probably all I had to say there. Thanks very much.
Do you want to show the section?
No, that's okay. If you want to read that report, it's like 176 pages. It goes through each country, looks at its funding, the kinds of programs that they do, how it was started up. It's in French and English, so it's on the website. And there's are you able to bring up it may be good to know, I don't know if you know that the conference, all the speakers that we invited here that have produced papers in the past, we asked them to post them, papers related to their topic here. So if you're wanting to read background.
That's all right. All right. Well, I'm really glad to see that the room filled up a little bit. So what I'm bringing to this discussion is actually, I think, a nice segue from what Kathy talked about. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Christopher Alley. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Virginia in the Department of Media Studies, and I specialize in local and community and public media policy in what we could think about as the North Atlantic Triangle, so Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And so I'm interested today in talking about what Canadian community media policy can learn, particularly from the United States and the United Kingdom. And the bulk of this talk and this research is coming out of my forthcoming book, Media Localism. So there is a shameless plug for everyone to go out and buy it when it comes out next December. I want to talk specifically about some of the best practices that us here in Canada can learn from the experiences in the United States and the United Kingdom. And to start us off, I think one thing I'm learning so much about today is what do we know about community media in Canada? And I'm learning a tremendous amount. But what I want to bring to this conversation is the question of what don't we know? What don't we know about Canadian community media policy? And there's some glaring gaps, particularly what the CRTC does not know.
How much time do you have, Chris?
Oh, well, you know what? We can just keep this going, but I'll keep it tight. I'll keep it tight. So, for instance, one of the things we don't know is we lack quantitative data on producers' content and relationships between community media, the public sector, and the private sector. And we lacked insight into this idea of local media ecosystems, acknowledging that these different media components of the broadcasting system, but also components of what would make up a media ecosystem, that they work together. So we need to start thinking more holistically about community media in the Canadian context and how community media shapes and is shaped by the other platforms of local media. And we can look to recent developments in the United States and the United Kingdom, which two countries that have relatively similar media systems to ourselves, for insights into how to address this paucity of knowledge and how to craft an appropriate policy response. So let me start off by giving a little bit of background on community media in both of these countries. So in the United States, particularly community broadcasting falls under three potential categories. First, we have public, educational, and governmental access channels, which are public access channels, kind of the very classic thing we think about as community television, available on local cable systems and funded by cable companies, although not managed by them. And this is something really important that both Dorothy and Kathy brought up. So they're not managed by them. We also have low-power television, low-power radio stations, similar to what we have here. And then there's this amorphous group called Class A television, which is a bit of a misnomer because Class A falls under something optimistically called the Community Broadcasting Act in the United States, except that what it has become is simply a low-power alternative for commercial networks. So despite the name community broadcasting, it's actually just a lot of Fox repeaters. Now, unlike Canada, the United States does not have a distinct community media policy, and instead regulation of community television and particular community television is located under the regulation of cable. PEG channels, public access, public education and governmental channels, are unlicensed, and it's up to individual communities to request these access channels when they negotiate with cable franchises. So, a big company like Comcast comes into a small town and says, hey, we want to offer cable in this, and it's up to the municipality to say, okay, you can come and you can use our right-of-way, but what we need you to do is provide us money and capital support and channel place for these access channels. There is also, though, a push in the United States to remove power away from the municipality and put it to the state. And often what we're seeing when that happens in a practice called statewide franchising, which is, a state like Texas will say, okay, we're going to govern all of these municipal cable franchises, and then we will not bring any money into community media. So again, we have a funding issue. That's actually just what I said. Like Canada, therefore, the regulatory terrain of community media in the U.S. is a bit of a jumble of ambiguous regulation and legislation. And in television, the regulator, the Federal Communications Commission, has been rather agnostic in rectifying this ambiguity and many of the grievances held by community broadcasters. So I just want to read a little bit of two paragraphs from a relatively recent report from 2011. So this is something called the Waldman Report, which is actually in the resources section in which I worked on. So it writes, at their best, PEG channels and community media centers help a community develop its ability to communicate. PEG channels can approximate a kind of hyper-local blogging with higher production values, cable distribution, and community connections. The community access centers can provide media production and literacy training, increasing the ability of community members to communicate effectively. So that's all good. At their worst, however, PEG channels provide an unnecessary platform for self-expression, as it is now available in abundance on the internet, and thus make up thus take up cable capacity and funding that could be used for more valuable and worthwhile programs. So this is how a working report from the Federal Communications Commission framed community media in the United States. Now, attempting to prove regulators wrong, PEG organizations have taken to rebranding themselves as community media centers and offering everything from classic video production to post-production editing, workshops to radio production, theater groups, resume construction, broadband provision, and even media policy literacy classes, all through kind of these community networks. So really rebranding themselves as community media centers. Moving across the Atlantic now, in contrast with both Canada and the United States, community media, at least in its video form or televisual form, is a relatively recent addition to the United Kingdom. Community television, though, has never really taken off, and since the country launched their new local television service in 2013, the last surviving over-the-air community television stations have actually lost their licenses. So there are no more over-the-air community television stations in the United Kingdom, although there are a handful of online and digital cable community channels. But by I mean a handful, I mean 3 or 4. But where the United Kingdom has really succeeded is in community radio. Community radio began in earnest in 2001. With a pilot project of 15 stations. And the report that emerged from this project serves as the backbone for something called the Community Radio Order in 2004, which officially sanctioned community radio and created the Community Radio Fund with an initial appropriation of about £500,000. I guess, what is that, about 750,000 Canadian dollars? What is it, two? Yeah. A million, maybe? Yeah. Ofcom, which is the Office of Communication, the UK's communication regulator, established 4 core elements for community radio, based on the criteria established in the Community Radio Order. So how it sees community radio is as the following. It is primarily for social gain rather than commercial reasons. It serves a particular community, a neighborhood or community of interest. It is not provided in order to make a profit. And it offers the target community opportunities to participate in the station. And despite some early setbacks, by 2012, the community radio sector boasted 198 stations and 254 licenses, and more licenses continue to be issued almost every month. And while most stations serve general audiences in a community of place, a tightly delineated kind of geographic area, which is about 59%, others do serve communities of interest within geographic localities. And community radio has quickly become a vital component in what we can think about as kind of a nascent or an emerging local media ecosystem. And this is something that the United Kingdom has been particularly aware of, and advocates for community television in the United Kingdom are really suggesting that regulators should look to community radio for how to establish a community television system. So while we do have this kind of regulatory and legislative terrain of community media, maybe quite confusing, a common point in the United States and the United Kingdom has been the implementation of in-depth investigations into what we can call local media ecosystems or local media ecologies. And this is what I want to argue. This is my big reveal today. I want to argue that this is where Canada really needs to take notice. So we need to be able to understand the contributions of community media at the individual local level, and from there to understand the relationships between community, public, and private media. And I'm not just talking about broadcasting, and I'm going to delve into this a little bit more. So local media ecosystems are the networks of media outlets within a geographic community. And Lou Friedland, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin in 2001, wrote that this is the range of communication activities that link networks of individuals, groups, and institutions in a specific community terrain or domain. So we can think of it as all the community media outlets in a community, all the media outlets in a community, everything from hyperlocal blogs to community and campus radio to ethnic media to your CTVs and global affiliates to CBC, and everything in between. Now, concern for local media ecosystems, particularly for local news and information, manifested in exhaustive studies in both the United Kingdom and the United States, and a lot of this was prompted by what we could think about as the crisis of journalism. You know, traditional journalism isn't making money. These countries had a lot of concern for this, and they decided to study it. So between Between 2003 and 2012, the FCC and Ofcom undertook these omnibus studies of local media. And importantly, these studies investigated not only the local media that fall under their jurisdiction, broadcasting, cable, and satellite, but also newspapers, online sites, community media, mobile platforms, journalism schools, and foundations, also public libraries, any entity that contributes to the production of local news and information in a community, in a geographic community. The understanding being that, this is a quote from the FCC, it is impossible to understand the information needs of communities without taking a holistic look at all media. And this is what I want to argue that Canada is in need of. So the two titles, and these documents are both available on the website as well. I emailed them to Kathy. So Ofcom released its study, Local and Regional Media in the United Kingdom, in 2009, and then the Federal Communications Commission released its iteration, The Information Needs of Communities, The Changing Media Landscape in a Broadband Age, in 2011. So let's go through, let's kind of unpack both of these reports. So in the United Kingdom, the Ofcom's report contained three major themes. First, how to define what does it mean to be local, which I think is a really good question that we don't talk about enough. The threat of the internet and digital media to traditional media outlets, and the roles of public and commercial media within a local media ecosystem. And they outlined what an ideal local media ecosystem should be doing. And I'll just quickly rattle these off. So a local media ecosystem should have a wide range of local content covering news, information, and community life, available across traditional media platforms, but also through the internet, delivered by a healthy and vibrant commercial media sector, but also from organizations employing a range of different ownership models, including the public sector and nonprofit. So already here we see an uncomfortable alliance to commercial media, reliance rather, and an underpinning by a spine of strong and independent local journalism. So in terms of community, Ofcom calls this ultra-local media. We call it hyper-local media. Ofcom uses ultra, which is just terrible. But it recognizes the growth of these platforms and their struggle but also their struggle for sustainability, business models, staffing, and general visibility. So, really echoing what Kathy said in her report. Nonetheless, what we see is they also acknowledge the benefits of ultra-local media to local media ecosystems because they localize programming to a greater extent than commercial media, fill the gaps left by commercial media, source out a variety of funding, grant social capital, and address issues or areas too small for coverage by traditional media. The American report now, which is known as the Waldman report for its chief architect, Stephen Waldman, went into more depth, went into an amazing amount of depth. This is an amazing document. It comes in at about 400 pages. And community media factors a major component of this report, with public access television being a focal point both in the hearings that led up to this report and in the report itself. Community television advocates also comprised a significant bulk of the written comments to the committee responsible to the report. And so PEG groups, for instance, focused heavily on justifying their existence in the digital age, arguing that their operations serve, like I said, as community centers, and that the internet is not a replacement for content that PEG produces, nor is it a physical replacement for the actual community media center. And this is just a quote taken from the Alliance for Communications Democracy. Again, this document is up there as well. PEG centers are evolving into community media centers that serve as anchor institutions in the community, enabling people to gain skills needed to more fully participate in the digital age. A significant benefit of PEG centers is that people gather together in classes, volunteer in each other's projects, and connect with communities of interest in ways that cross class, race, and ideological divides. The Alliance for Communications Democracy thus linked the role of PEG to communities of geography and communities of interest into democratic participation. And so for them, the internet is both everywhere and nowhere, suggesting that while a valuable tool, it cannot replace the physical presence of these centers. So what have we done here? Canada has yet to assess its local media ecosystems in a fashion anyway close to these reports. So what we have is the 2008 Diversity of Voices proceeding conducted by the CRTC, which surveyed only professional voices and is now actually really out of date. But the closest we've come to an omnibus study of our local media ecosystems is the 2003 House of Commons report, Our Cultural Sovereignty, more commonly referred to as the Lincoln Report. Now, its mandate was to assess the Canadian broadcasting industry in light of the goals set out in the 1991 Broadcasting Act. And of course, a major factor were provisions in the Act that promote Canadian reflection and Canadian production. And this included local broadcasting. And a considerable portion was devoted to local, regional, and community broadcasting. And one of the report's most important, but seldom recalled conclusions was the difficulty of actually separating the difference between community, local, and regional in Canadian media. And the report actually chastised the CRTC for failing to ameliorate these definitional problems. And in fact, it wrote that the committee is of the view that the CRTC's new community media policy, which was the 2002 policy, does very little to resolve the definitional ambiguities and inconsistencies inherent in the existing uses of the terms community, local, and regional. And as the report continued, as should be clear, finding satisfactory definitions is quite difficult. And while the report offered no concrete definitions of its own, it did advise the Department of Canadian Heritage and the CRTC to resolve these challenges on their own, which of course they haven't. More specifically, also, the report pointed to a lack of a unified understanding of these key terms and advised the CRTC to clarify its, quote, bewildering array of policies. Now, given that the 2010 iteration of the community media policy is largely based on the 2002 version, this ambiguity is still in place today. So how are we to define the parameters of community media for Canadians? And this is something that both the US and UK local media ecosystem reports have done really quite well, and something that I want to argue that we need to do too. So what best practices can we learn from these experiences? Well, first and foremost, like I say, we are in need of a comprehensive study of local media ecosystems in Canada. And this would, of course, include not only broadcasting, but all components of a local media ecosystem. Because the challenges identified by the Lincoln Report in 2003, most notably the bewildering complexity of community broadcasting policies and ambiguous definitions used to categorize local, regional, and community media, still need to be rectified. But this can only happen once we have people on the ground, so to speak. Another one, like I said, is just an overall recognition that the regulator needs to pay attention to ecosystems rather than just the media within its jurisdiction. Doesn't mean that they have to regulate them, of course not, but they need to be aware of who is providing what. And this is stuff we don't know. And an important outcome, if we look from Canada's past, an important outcome of the Lincoln Report was the recommendation of a holistic and comprehensive local, regional, and community media policy. Now, according to the report, the framework would be made in consultation with a variety of stakeholders, including public, private, and community, educational, non-for-profit media, and related interest groups. And this policy would include a statement of objectives, realistic estimates of cost, performance measures, be technologically neutral, and recognize the contributions made by all media types. In other words, a policy recognizing local media ecosystems. The last thing that we can talk about as well is Community Media Fund, which was recommended by the Lincoln Report. And we're actually seeing calls for it even in the United States, where we've got a couple of scholars calling for a local news fund, and quite a lot of conversation going to moving from public broadcasting to public media to fund a lot of the non-traditional, non-broadcasting elements that make up a local media ecosystem. So the problem here, of course, is that these reports, while they remain important documents in assessing local media ecologies and attest to the role that community media play in delivering the critical information needs of communities, have largely gone ignored, right? But they should not. These findings should not fall into disuse or victim to the regulatory amnesia that focus on the new and the now. And it is time, I want to argue, and this is where I want to end, the CRTC and Heritage pay attention not only to local broadcasting, but to local media. And this, of course, includes us here in community media. So thank you very much. And last we have Gretchen King, who is going to take us around the world again.
So I'm going to switch mediums and talk about radio. I know, Chris, you gave some props to the wonderful community radio movement in the UK. But I think it's interesting to hear about the evolution of the practices and the gaps in practices across mediums as well. I think that's really valuable. And I have to say that there's always been a relationship that's existed between community television and community radio. So one of the first one of the first experimental licensed issue in Canada was issued to the Vancouver Cooperative Media radio station. So Vancouver Co-op Radio was ultimately started by people working in different mediums. There were local community television producers who were producing VHS tapes, who put aside their VHS tapes to go and start this radio station. There was a local print activist who put aside their print work to go and help this, well, maybe they didn't put it aside, but in addition to the print work, they went to help this cooperative. My point is that our roots are multimedia and have common history in that practice, in that people have always gone between these mediums. We've never just been television producers. We've never just been radio producers. And so that's evident, and that's in the history. It's not something that I'm necessarily going to talk about today because my presentation focuses on radio. I came to put together this history as part of my PhD studies at McGill. I was researching community radio news practices at a radio station in Jordan. In 2000, they went online, and their reports, their independent community-produced news reports, would be broadcast on nearby stations in Palestine. Well, Radio Balad set up in Amman to produce local news in Amman, but because of the geographical mapping of the region, and also because FM frequency is line of sight, meaning as far as the signal is going and is not going to crash into a mountain or a whole bunch of trees or a whole bunch of buildings, you can tune in. So their reports that they were uploading online in 2000 were being broadcast on nearby stations in Palestine. And so they were able to get on the airwaves before regulations, even in Jordan, allowed them to access the airwaves. And so this is a history of more than 100 years of practice just to contextualize this one station, because it blew lots of people's minds that they would actually go online first and they would kind of do something illegal, right? Getting on the airwaves on the local FM dial, but via Palestine. But that's actually the way it worked, clear around the world. Community broadcasting was not originally conceived by regulators. When they set up the spectrum, this was the first broadcast technology of the industrial period. What was going on at the time? War, imperialism, carving up the countries of the world. They carved up the spectrum. There were conventions in 1903 and 1906, and you basically see the world powers coming together and deciding this spectrum is going to be allocated for this military use, this spectrum is going to be allocated for these states to use it, and screw the rest of the world, you're not here, and you're not our allies. So that happened, and obviously that got problematized. Everybody else wants access to the spectrum too. But in the context of that, and the context of not even being considered by regulators and the people carving up the spectrum, you always found, clear across the world, instances of communities accessing the airwaves. So I organized this history just to sort of put Radio Balad's practices in context, because yes, as we saw with the policy landscape, or even in the history that Kathy showed, or even in the examples that Barbara brought up, there is a diversity of practices where we don't all run by the same regulations.